Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story, true scary stories from quiet February nights. The rural outskirts of Blacksburg, Virginia, experienced an unusually silent stretch of weather during the first week of February 2020. Mark Henderson was a 45-year-old freelance archivist who lived alone in a renovated farmhouse located several miles from the nearest paved road. He moved to the region specifically for the isolation, which allowed him to process large volumes of historical documents without the distractions of city life. Local dispatch logs indicated that the area was under a stagnant high-pressure system, which resulted in nights that were remarkably still and devoid of wind. Mark spent his evenings working in a second-floor office that offered a panoramic view of the dormant fields and the dense tree line beyond the property fence. On the night of February 4th, Mark reportedly noticed a series of disturbances that did not align with the typical behavior of local woodland animals. He was reviewing a county file from 1984 when he heard a sharp metallic tapping sound originating from the exterior of the ground floor windows. State records from that month showed that temperatures remained well below freezing, which often caused the old timber frames of the house to contract and groan. However, the tapping followed a deliberate and repeating sequence that suggested a source with intent rather than a natural environmental shift. Mark remained in his office while the sound moved slowly from the kitchen windows toward the heavy oak door of the main entrance, is less than has-hone. Zero hash is greater than. Investigators later reviewed archive notes from a similar incident that occurred in a neighboring township during the winter of 2012. In that case, a resident claimed that an unidentified individual would stand in the shadows of the porch and tap on the glass with a small stone. County files from 2020 confirm that Mark contacted the local authorities at approximately 11 in the evening to report a potential trespasser on his land. The dispatch logs recorded that he was advised to stay inside and lock all access points until a patrol car could reach his remote location. Mark watched the security monitor in his office, but the infrared cameras showed no heat signatures or movement in the immediate vicinity of the porch. The patrol arrived 30 minutes later and conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter using high-intensity spotlights to pierce the winter fog. State records indicate that the officers found a series of depressions in the frost that resembled human footprints, but they lacked any discernible tread pattern. Some locals claimed that certain individuals in the region practiced a form of stealth hunting where they wore heavy wool wrappings over their boots to muffle their movement. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of the gravel driveway without leading toward the road or the woods. The officers eventually cleared the scene after finding no signs of forced entry or physical damage to the property structure. By the following evening, the silence of the February night returned with an intensity that Mark described as being physically oppressive in his personal journals. He decided to install additional motion-activated lighting around the barn and the rear garden to deter any further unwanted visitors. Reported sightings of a pale figure standing near the tree line had been documented in archived notes from the previous decade, but were never substantiated with photographic evidence. As Mark was adjusting the settings on his laptop, he heard a faint vocalization that sounded like a person whispering his name from the hallway. He checked every room in the farmhouse, but found that he was entirely alone and all the windows remained securely latched from the inside. Records conflict regarding the frequency of these auditory anomalies, as some experts believe the layout of the valley can carry voices over several miles under specific atmospheric conditions. County file from 2009 mentioned that the mineral composition of the local bedrock could cause strange acoustic reflections during periods of extreme cold. Mark reportedly experienced a second night of tapping on the glass, but this time, the sounds originated from the second floor windows, which were 20 feet above the ground. He retreated to the basement, where he spent the remainder of the night while monitoring the house through his internal security network. Dispatch logs from February 6th show that no further calls were placed by the resident, despite his documented history of reporting disturbances. When a delivery driver arrived at the farmhouse 3 days later, they found the front door standing wide open and the interior lights fully illuminated. State records noted that Mark's vehicle was still parked in the driveway, and all of his personal belongings, including his wallet and phone, were found on the kitchen table. Investigators found archived notes in his office that detailed a timeline of the tapping sounds and the specific intervals at which they occurred. A search of the property and the surrounding woods was conducted over a 2-week period, but no trace of Mark Henderson was ever located by the teams. Some locals claimed that he had simply reached a breaking point with the isolation and chose to walk away from his life without a word. The official report remains open, and the house was eventually sold to a family from out of state who reported no unusual activity during their first year of residence. County files from 2022 indicate that the case was transferred to a cold case unit after all forensic leads were exhausted at the site. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping sounds were a prank, a natural phenomenon, or something more targeted toward the previous occupant. The events of that quiet February night serve as a reminder of how easily the silence of the rural landscape can be misunderstood. Mark Henderson remains on the list of missing persons, and the archived notes of his experience are the only evidence that anything unusual ever occurred. During the search of the basement level, investigators discovered a secondary county file from 1976 that had been moved from the upstairs office. This document described a series of disappearances in the Blacksburg area that occurred during the coldest weeks of February over several decades. State records indicated that none of these individuals were ever recovered, and their properties were often found with the doors left unlocked. The archived notes suggested that the incidents were linked by the presence of rhythmic tapping sounds reported by neighbors prior to the disappearances. Forensic teams examined the basement floor and found that the dust layers had been disturbed in a pattern that matched the movement of heavy furniture. No fingerprints other than those belonging to Mark were recovered from the metal filing cabinets or the basement windows. A local historian later provided dispatch logs from 1991 that detailed a similar event involving a retired teacher living in a nearby cabin. This individual had reportedly contacted the authorities to complain about a tall figure that appeared to be mimicking his daily routines from the tree line. Archived notes from the police department showed that the investigation was closed when the teacher moved to a different state without providing a forwarding address. Some locals claimed that the figure was a remnant of a settlement that had been abandoned during the 19th century due to a severe winter. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a settlement, and the land records from that era remain largely incomplete. The connection between these historical events and the disappearance of Mark Henderson remains purely circumstantial according to state records. The forensic examination of the farmhouse windows revealed that the tapping had left microscopic fractures in the glass that were only visible under specialized lighting. The county file from 2021 noted that these fractures were consistent with a high-frequency vibration rather than a physical strike from a solid object. This data conflicted with Mark's original report of someone using a small stone to tap on the exterior of the house. Investigators searched the local power grid logs to see if a malfunctioning electrical transformer could have caused the vibrations, but the results were negative. State records indicate that the surrounding properties did not experience any similar glass damage or auditory disturbances during the month of February. The source of the energy required to create such precise fractures in the tempered glass remains unidentified by technical experts. The search for Mark Henderson was officially suspended in late March when the spring thaw began to saturate the low-lying areas of the property. Dispatch logs from the final day of the operation noted that the canine units were consistently drawn to a specific section of the limestone cliffs. Archived notes from the Geological Survey team mentioned that these cliffs contained several deep fissures that were not large enough for a person to enter. However, the dogs continued to alert on the openings until the handlers were forced to move them away due to the hazardous terrain. State records from that period show no evidence of human remains or clothing being found near the rock formations. The mystery of the quiet February nights in Blacksburg continues to be a subject of local speculation among those who remember the archivist. In the years following the disappearance, several hikers reported hearing rhythmic tapping while camping in the woods near the old Henderson farmhouse. The county file from 2024 recorded a statement from a group of students who claimed the sound followed them for several miles. Investigators never confirmed these reports as the students were unable to provide a recording of the sounds or a specific location for the source. State records show that the forest in that region is now designated as a protected zone with limited access during the winter months. The archive notes from the Henderson case are still referenced by researchers interested in the acoustic anomalies of the Appalachian foothills. No further evidence has emerged to explain the events of February 2020, and the file remains in the state archives. The final entry in Mark's personal journal mentioned a feeling of intense cold that seemed to permeate the house despite the functioning heating system. He wrote that the silence outside was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the walls. County files suggest that this psychological state is common among individuals experiencing long periods of extreme isolation in remote environments. However, the physical evidence of the footprints and the glass fractures continues to challenge the theory of a purely psychological event. Investigators never confirmed if Mark was aware of the 1976 file before he began experiencing the disturbances at the farmhouse. The story of the quiet February nights remains a cold case in the records of the Virginia State Police. In this new story, true scary hiking stories from deep Appalachia. The Appalachian Trail near the town of Damascus, Virginia, remained a favored destination for experienced hikers during the spring of 2016. Thomas Miller was a 32-year-old civil engineer who spent his weekends navigating the more isolated ridgelines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He arrived at the trailhead with the intention of completing a 40-mile loop through the high country over 3 days. Local dispatch logs indicated that the weather conditions were favorable when Thomas first set out into the dense timber and rocky terrain. The initial stretch of the journey followed a well-marked path that climbed steadily toward the limestone cliffs overlooking the valley below. The forest canopy in this region of the southern mountains was known for its ability to block out almost all natural sunlight even during the midday hours. Thomas noted in his personal logs that the atmosphere felt unusually heavy as he crossed the state line into a less traveled wilderness sector. State records from 2016 show that the local wildlife populations were stable and there were no reports of aggressive bear activity in the vicinity. He reached the first elevation marker by late afternoon and prepared to transition into the deeper drainage basins that defined the central loop. The trail narrowed significantly here as the hardwoods gave way to ancient hemlocks and thick blankets of damp mountain laurel. By the second afternoon, Thomas reportedly reached a section of the forest where the undergrowth became significantly more dense and difficult to navigate. State records from that period noted that several hikers had previously reported feeling a sense of disorientation while passing through this specific drainage basin. He decided to establish a temporary camp near a small creek that was not clearly marked on his primary topographic map. Investigators later found archive notes suggesting that the topography in this region often shifted due to seasonal runoff and minor geological movements. Thomas settled into his tent as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountain range. The temperature dropped rapidly as the shadows stretched across the creek bed and the sounds of the local bird population went completely silent. Thomas started a small fire using dry wood he gathered from the perimeter of his camp to maintain some level of visibility. He felt a persistent sensation of being watched from the dark tree line, but he attributed the feeling to the isolation of the deep woods. Archived notes from a forestry survey conducted in 2012 mentioned that the acoustics in this valley could create strange echoes. Thomas finished his meal and extinguished the fire before retreating into the safety of his reinforced nylon tent for the evening. The silence of the high wilderness was interrupted by what Thomas described as rhythmic thudding sounds originating from the heavy brush nearby. He remained inside his sleeping bag while observing the thin fabric of the tent for any signs of external movement or shadows. County files from 2016 contain a brief statement from a witness who claimed to hear unusual vocalizations in that general area. These accounts were never confirmed by local authorities who searched the site for evidence of large predators or unauthorized human encampments. Thomas stayed awake for several hours while the sounds continued to move in a slow circle around his immediate campsite. At approximately 2 in the morning, the rhythmic thudding stopped and was replaced by the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the rocky soil. Thomas reached for his flashlight, but he hesitated to turn it on because he did not want to reveal his exact position. The dragging sound moved toward the creek and then circled back toward the rear of the tent where his food bag hung. Dispatch logs from that night showed no other hikers were registered in that specific 5-mile radius of the wilderness area. The unknown entity seemed to move with a calculated precision that did not match the typical scavenging patterns of a black bear. Thomas gripped his small folding knife while listening to the sound of heavy breathing just a few feet from his head. As the first light of dawn appeared, the sounds abruptly ceased, and Thomas emerged from his tent to inspect the surrounding perimeter. He reportedly found several heavy stones that had been moved from the creek bed and placed in a straight line near his gear. Some locals claimed that this behavior matched historical reports of territorial displays by individuals living off the grid in the deep woods. Investigators found no physical evidence of footprints or clothing fibers that would link a specific person to the disturbed rocks or noise. Thomas decided to abandon his original plan and began a rapid descent toward the nearest access road several miles away, is less than #. 0 hash is greater than. The descent was complicated by a thick layer of mountain fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in every direction. Thomas struggled to keep his bearings as the trail seemed to weave through sections of the forest that he did not recognize. The county files from 2009 mentioned a similar case of a hiker who became lost when the trail markers vanished. He checked his compass multiple times, only to find that the needle was spinning erratically near certain rock formations in the gorge. This phenomenon was noted in state records as being caused by high iron content in the local subterranean mineral deposits. Thomas pushed forward through the gray mist while hearing the faint sound of snapping branches behind him. The trek back to the trailhead required Thomas to pass through a narrow gorge where the trail was frequently obscured by fallen hemlock trees. He noticed that the trail markers appeared to have been scraped away from the bark of the trees with a sharp instrument. Dispatch logs from that week showed that a maintenance crew had verified the markers were intact only 3 days prior to his arrival. Records conflict regarding whether the damage was caused by environmental factors or intentional tampering by an unidentified individual in the forest. Thomas reached his vehicle in the late afternoon and immediately contacted the local ranger station to report the anomalies. Search teams later surveyed the gorge, but they could not find any tools or evidence of a person residing in that sector. The official report remains open because state records cannot explain the rapid removal of the trail markers over such a large distance. Thomas never returned to that specific region of Appalachia, and he chose to hike in more populated state parks in the years following. The events of 2016 are still discussed by some hikers who frequent the Damascus area, but the facts remain largely inconclusive. Investigators never confirmed the source of the rhythmic sounds or the purpose of the stones moved during the night. The archived notes from the subsequent investigation included a testimony from a neighboring landowner who resided 5 miles from the trailhead. This individual reported seeing unidentified lights moving along the ridgeline during the same 48-hour period that Thomas was in the woods. County files from 2016 do not include any record of authorized search and rescue operations or aerial surveys that would account for the lights. Forensic analysts examined the stones found at the campsite and determined they were sourced from a geological layer located much deeper in the creek bed. This suggested that whoever moved the stones possessed significant physical strength or spent several hours working in total darkness. The case was eventually moved to an inactive status due to a lack of actionable evidence or criminal complaints. State records from 2017 indicate that 2 more hikers reported similar encounters with rhythmic thudding and rearranged forest debris in the same drainage basin. Neither of these individuals were able to provide a visual description of the entity or person responsible for the disturbances. Local law enforcement increased patrols near the Damascus access points for several months, but no unauthorized residents were ever located. Dispatch logs from that period show a series of noise complaints that were dismissed as wind whistling through the limestone caverns. The archived notes conclude that while the experiences were consistent, they lacked the physical proof required for a formal intervention. Thomas remains one of the few witnesses who provided a detailed timeline of the events from that spring weekend. Investigators later reviewed old county file from 2009, which detailed a missing persons case in the same northern sector of the trail. A 24-year-old botanist named Sarah Jenkins had disappeared while collecting plant samples near the limestone gorge. Search and rescue logs from that year indicated that her camp was found completely undisturbed, with all of her gear intact and functional. The only anomaly noted in the state records was a collection of river stones arranged in a geometric pattern inside her tent. Canine units were unable to pick up a scent trail, and the case was eventually labeled as a cold file due to a total lack of physical leads. Thomas noted that the arrangement of stones he found bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions in the archived notes from 2009. Reported sightings of a tall, gaunt figure in the periphery of the woods began to surface in local community forums shortly after the incident with Thomas. These accounts remained largely anecdotal, as no photographic evidence was ever produced to support the claims of the residents. Dispatch logs from 2018 mentioned a series of unexplained thefts from local homesteads involving only heavy iron tools and basic survival supplies. Investigators searched the higher elevations for any signs of a primitive shelter, but the terrain proved too treacherous for a sustained ground operation. Some locals claimed that an individual had been living in the deep caverns beneath the gorge for several decades without detection. These theories were never confirmed by geological surveys, which indicated the cavern systems were mostly inaccessible to human beings. By the winter of 2019, the region was hit by a record-breaking snowstorm that effectively sealed off the Damascus trailhead for several weeks. When the snow melted, local rangers found that a significant portion of the old-growth forest had been marked with the same deep scrapings Thomas reported. County files documented that the scrapings reached heights of nearly 10 feet on some of the larger oak trees in the gorge. This data conflicted with the theory of a typical human vandal, as no ladders or climbing equipment were found in the vicinity. Archived notes from the forestry department suggested that the marks could have been caused by falling ice or wind-blown debris during the intense storm. However, the precision of the marks led many to believe that the cause was intentional and directed toward the existing trail infrastructure. The case remains a point of contention among local historians and wilderness enthusiasts who frequent the southern Appalachian range. State records continue to list the area as a high caution zone for solo hikers due to the persistent history of unexplained mechanical failures and navigational errors. Thomas Miller eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he continued his engineering career, but he reportedly stopped hiking in deep wilderness entirely. He maintained that the sounds he heard in 2016 were not those of a person or an animal he could identify. The mystery of the Damascus Gorge continues to produce occasional reports of rhythmic thudding and rearranged stones to this day. Investigators never confirmed a suspect, and the woods remain as silent and observational as they were during that spring weekend in 2016. In this new story, quiet California urban legends that people still whisper about at night. In 2022, state records from a coastal county in California detailed a series of strange occurrences involving hikers. Local authorities reportedly investigated multiple claims of unidentified figures moving through the dense fog during the early morning hours near Big Sur. These archived notes suggest that several individuals vanished without a trace while walking along the well-marked trails of the region. Investigators never confirmed any foul play, yet some locals claim that certain sections of the forest should remain completely avoided. The official dispatch logs indicate that search parties found only abandoned equipment left behind by the missing people during late autumn. Mark was a 34-year-old park ranger who worked specifically within the rugged terrain of the Central Coast. His daily job required him to monitor wildlife patterns and maintain the safety of the various trails used by seasonal tourists. He arrived at the remote observation station with the goal of documenting local coyote populations for a state-funded study. Records conflict regarding his exact location during the final hours of his shift before he failed to check in officially. The county file from 2009 mentions that no distress signal was ever received from his standard-issue radio equipment. Mark reportedly left his official vehicle parked at the trailhead with the engine still running and the driver door open. The search team discovered a set of footprints that appeared to lead directly into a solid wall of thick brush. Archived notes from the investigation describe how the tracks stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. State records indicate that the soil around the tracks showed no signs of a struggle or any other human presence. Investigators never confirmed if the footprints belonged to Mark or if another person had been walking in that specific area. The county file from 2009 remains one of the most puzzling cases for the local sheriff department to solve. Some locals claimed that they heard a metallic tapping sound coming from the canyon for several nights after he disappeared. Sarah was a 28-year-old freelance photographer who traveled to the area to capture the unique natural light. She spent most of her time near the cliff edges where the Pacific Ocean meets the rocky shoreline of Northern California. Her purpose for being in the location was to complete a series of images for a prestigious travel magazine project. Sarah reportedly told her friends that she felt a strange sensation of being watched while she was taking her photographs. State records show that her last social media post was a photo of the ocean taken at 4 in the afternoon. The image appears to show a dark shape standing just behind a cluster of trees on the edge of the cliff. Dispatch logs reveal that several residents called the police to report a woman screaming near the beach that same evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the screams, and they found no evidence of any person being in distress there. Archived notes describe how her car was found, with the keys still in the ignition and her wallet on the seat. Some locals claimed that the coastal fog can play tricks on the ears and make the wind sound like human voices. State records from 2023 indicate that a commercial diver found a small piece of blue fabric near the rocks. This fabric reportedly matched the color of the jacket Sarah was wearing on the day that she was last seen alive. The small-town residents often speak about a third individual named David, who was a 40-year-old local historian. David spent many years collecting old maps of the Sierra Nevada mountains to find the location of the lost village. The county file from 2009 includes a map that he had hand-drawn with several red circles on it. State records show that he purchased a large amount of survival gear just 2 days before he left for his trip. Some locals claimed that David believed the lost village was protected by people who did not want to be found. Investigators never confirmed if he reached his destination, but they found his empty tent near a remote mountain stream. Archived notes mention that the tent was torn from the inside as if something was trying to get out quickly. A local rancher reportedly told the sheriff that he saw a group of men dressed in dark clothing near the stream. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that the rancher was considered a reliable witness by the local authorities at the time. State records show that the men were never identified and they seem to have no connection to the nearby towns. Records conflict regarding whether the men were carrying tools or if they were simply walking through the dense forest area. Investigators never confirmed if these men were related to the disappearance of David or the other missing hikers in California. The county file from 2009 mentions that several other historians had disappeared in the same region over decades. Some locals claimed that there are secret tunnels under the mountains that date back to the time of the gold rush. State records indicate that no such tunnels have ever been officially discovered by geologists or by any modern survey teams. Archived notes from 2012 describe a series of low-frequency vibrations that were recorded by seismic sensors in the area. Investigators never confirmed the cause of these vibrations, but they noted that the local wildlife became very agitated and loud. Records conflict on whether these events are linked to the urban legends that continue to haunt the rural coastal towns. Another report in the dispatch logs from 2019 describes a driver who claimed to see a transparent figure on Highway 1. The driver was a 50-year-old long-haul trucker who had been working the California routes for 20 years. He reportedly saw a person standing in the middle of the road during a heavy rainstorm near the Big Sur Bridge. State records show that he slammed on his brakes, but there was no impact and no body was ever found. Investigators never confirmed if the trucker was suffering from fatigue or if he truly saw something on the lonely road. Archived notes from the Highway Patrol mention that 3 other drivers reported the same figure during that specific weekend. Some locals claimed that the figure is a woman who vanished from a nearby resort during the summer of 1990. Records conflict regarding her name, but the county file from 2009 contains a missing person report from that era. State records indicate that she was a 42-year-old tourist from Oregon who was visiting the coast alone. Dispatch logs from 1990 show that her hotel room was left exactly as if she intended to return shortly. Investigators never confirmed any leads in her case, and the file was eventually moved to the cold case department for review. The archive notes mention that her footprints were found leading away from the resort and into the deep ocean water. In 2021, a group of researchers found a set of old keys buried in the sand near the cliffs. The county file from 2009 lists these keys as a possible match for a car owned by David. State records show that the keys were heavily corroded, but they still functioned when they were tested on a similar lock. Some locals claimed that finding the keys was a sign that the missing people are still present in the area. Investigators never confirmed this theory, and the keys were placed into an evidence locker for further study by forensic teams. Archived notes from the lab report indicate that there was no usable DNA found on the surface of the metal. Dispatch logs from the winter of 2024 mention a series of strange phone calls to the local police station. The callers reportedly heard nothing but heavy breathing and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks on the line. State records show that these calls were traced back to a phone booth that had been disconnected for 15 years. Investigators never confirmed how a disconnected phone could make outgoing calls to the emergency dispatch center during the middle of the night. Records conflict on whether this was a technical glitch in the aging phone system or a series of deliberate pranks. Some locals claimed that the calls always happen on the anniversary of the major disappearances in the coastal region. Archive notes from a retired sheriff detail his personal belief that the geography of California hides many secrets from the public. He reportedly spent his retirement years cataloging the various urban legends and mapping them against the official state records of incidents. The county file from 2009 contains a letter he wrote to the governor regarding the high number of cases. State records show that the governor never responded to the letter, and the sheriff passed away in 2021. Investigators never confirmed if his research had any merit or if he was simply an old man with too much time. Some locals claimed that his private journals were taken by men in dark suits after his funeral ended. Records conflict regarding the contents of those journals, but some believe they contained the truth about the missing people of California. Archive notes from a local librarian suggest that the sheriff had found a pattern in the dates of the disappearances. State records show that most of the events occur during the transition between the spring and the summer seasons each year. Dispatch logs from 2025 indicate that two more hikers have gone missing near the same coastal trail system. Investigators never confirmed if these new cases are related to the historical legends that have been told for many years. Some locals claimed that the forest is slowly expanding and reclaiming the land that was once occupied by the settlers. The county file from 2009 remains a primary source of information for those who seek to understand these events. State records will continue to document the facts, while the urban legends will continue to grow in the quiet coastal towns. Archived notes from the investigation suggest that the truth may never be fully known by the authorities or the public. Investigators never confirmed any supernatural activity, but the data they collected remains difficult to explain using only modern scientific methods. Records conflict on the final count of people who have vanished into the fog of the Northern California coastline. Some locals claimed that if you listen closely to the wind, you can still hear the voices of the missing. In this news story, Washington's small-town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skycomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of three individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mentioned that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The three friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archive notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the small town. In this news story, true scary stories of growing up in Appalachia they never warned us about. The Appalachian mountain range contains thousands of square miles of dense forest and deep valleys that remain largely unexplored today. Many residents of these isolated communities prefer to avoid the high ridges and deep hollows when the sun goes down. Jacob Miller was a 25-year-old surveyor who graduated from a technical college in the year 2012. He accepted a contract to map the boundaries of a large timber property located in the heart of Logan County. His objective involved placing physical markers every 50 feet to define the limits of a future logging operation site. State records from 2015 indicate that the project was part of a larger economic development plan for the region. The valley known as Black Hollow earned its name because the steep mountain walls blocked the light for most day. Archived notes from the 1920s describe the area as a place where the air remains cold even in July. Jacob drove his heavy truck through several small towns where the locals watched him with a sense of quiet suspicion. He reached the end of a gravel road and parked his vehicle near a rusted gate that was locked shut. Reportedly, the local utility companies refused to service the hollow due to the frequent equipment failures and the rough terrain. Jacob checked his radio and noted that he was already losing the signal from the nearest tower in the city. State records mentioned that the last official residence in the hollow was a small homestead that burned in 1970. Dispatch logs from that year recorded a series of strange sightings by the fire crews who responded to the scene. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the fire, and the county file from 2009 noted the case closed. Some locals claimed that the fire was set intentionally to drive out a family that refused to sell their land. Records conflict regarding the names of the victims, but the stories of the tragedy persisted in the local folklore area. Jacob ignored the local legends and focused on the technical requirements of the surveying job he needed to finish today. The hike into the center of the hollow took over 2 hours because the undergrowth was thick with thorny vines. Jacob carried a heavy pack filled with iron pins and a sledgehammer along with his digital GPS tracking device unit. He noticed that the forest was strangely quiet, and even the common birds of West Virginia seemed to be absent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that muffled the sound of his heavy leather boots. He reached the first corner of the property and began searching for the original boundary marker from 1924. He found a rusted piece of metal protruding from the base of a massive oak tree that looked very ancient. Jacob set up his tripod and began the process of verifying the coordinates using the satellite data on his screen. He noticed that his GPS unit was fluctuating wildly and gave him readings that were several hundred feet off target. Reportedly, the geological composition of the Appalachian Mountains can sometimes interfere with electronic signals during the summer months here. He decided to rely on his compass and the physical descriptions found in the old county files for his work. A sudden sound of a heavy branch snapping nearby caused him to pause and reach for the bear spray on belt. He scanned the trees but saw nothing except for the swaying leaves and the shifting shadows of the deep forest. As he moved deeper into the hollow, he stumbled upon the remains of a log structure hidden behind some brush. The cabin was built in the style of the early 1900s with a stone chimney that was mostly collapsed. Archived notes from the Historical Society suggested that this was the site of a failed mining office from 2011. Jacob walked toward the open doorway and saw that the interior was filled with rotted furniture and old rusted cans. He saw a series of strange markings carved into the wooden doorframe that looked like a tally of days. Some locals claimed that a hermit lived in this cabin until his disappearance in the winter of 24. He stepped inside the cabin to escape a sudden downpour of rain that began to fall from the gray sky. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old coal smoke, which felt very oppressive in the small, cramped space. He found a handwritten ledger on the floor that contained names and dates from the year 2009. Dispatch logs from that period mentioned a search for a missing hiker who was last seen near this cabin site. Investigators never confirmed if the ledger belonged to the missing man or a squatter who was living in the woods. Jacob took a photo of the ledger and prepared to leave as the rain began to taper off outside now. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and caused Jacob to feel very nauseous. He recognized the sound as an acoustic anomaly often reported in deep valleys where the wind hits the rock faces. County records from 2016 include several testimonies from park rangers who experienced similar physical sensations in the area. Jacob walked back into the clearing and saw that his survey tripod had been knocked over on the wet ground. He was certain that he had been alone in the woods, but the damage to his equipment suggested otherwise today. He carefully inspected the area for tracks, but the damp leaves made it impossible to see any clear footprints there. He heard a sharp whistle coming from the ridge above the cabin that sounded exactly like a human signal call. Jacob shouted a greeting into the forest, but the only response was the rhythmic tapping of wood against a tree. Some archived notes from the regional forestry department mentioned that timber poachers used these signals to communicate with each other. He decided to pack his gear and move toward the secondary survey site located on the eastern slope of hill. The feeling of being watched intensified as he climbed the steep terrain and moved away from the old log cabin. He kept his head down and focused on the path while checking his watch every few minutes to track time. He found a series of deep trenches that were dug into the hillside and lined with heavy pieces of plastic. State records from 2003 mentioned that illegal excavations were common in areas with potential for gold or gems. Jacob saw fresh cigarette butts near the edge of the trench, which indicated that someone was here very recently today. He realized that he might be encroaching on an active illegal mining operation that was not authorized by the state. Reportedly, these groups can be very protective of their sites and often use intimidation to keep strangers away from area. He began to back away from the trenches while trying to remain as quiet as possible in the thick brush. He saw a small pile of personal items near a tree that included a pair of child shoes and glasses. The county file from 2009 mentioned that a family vanished from a nearby campsite without leaving a trace. Investigators never confirmed if the items were connected to the missing family or if they were just discarded mountain trash. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the danger of his situation in this remote part of Hollow. He turned to walk back the way he came and saw a figure standing silently on the trail ahead of. The person was wearing a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face from his view. Jacob stopped and raised his hands to show that he was not a threat to the person on the trail. He explained that he was a surveyor for the state and was only here to map the boundaries of property. The figure did not respond and simply pointed toward the ridge before turning and walking back into the dense trees. Records conflict regarding the presence of any registered residents in this specific section of the Logan County forest land. Jacob waited for several minutes until he was sure the stranger was gone before he continued down the narrow path. He felt his heart racing in his chest as he realized how isolated he truly was from any outside help. The sun began to drop behind the mountain peaks and cast long and distorted shadows across the forest floor today. Jacob knew that he could not navigate the terrain in the dark and needed to find a safe place soon. He found a small rock overhang that offered some protection from the elements and the wind blowing from the north. He sat with his back against the stone and kept his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention to his location. Some locals claimed that the woods come alive at night, with sounds that have no logical explanation for the people. He heard a series of heavy thuds that sounded like someone was dropping large rocks into the deep valley below. He used his flashlight briefly to check his map and saw a trail that was not listed on any document. Archived notes from the 1950s mentioned a secret road used by moonshiners during the era of the Prohibition laws. He decided to follow the trail in the morning because it appeared to lead directly toward the main highway exit. The sound of a metallic scraping began again and seemed to be coming from the woods directly above his head. Jacob stayed awake for most of the night and listened to the strange noises that echoed through the dark hollow. He felt a deep sense of dread that he could not explain despite his professional training and his personal experience. The first light of dawn revealed a heavy mist that clung to the trees and made visibility very difficult today. Jacob gathered his belongings and started walking down the secret trail while keeping a hand on his heavy survey equipment. He found a rusted metal sign that was nailed to a tree and written in a language he did not. Dispatch logs from 2012 recorded a similar report of a strange sign found by a group of local hikers. Investigators never confirmed the meaning of the sign and suggested it was a prank by some local high school students. Jacob reached a clearing and saw his truck parked in the distance, which gave him a great sense of relief. When he reached his vehicle, he saw that the tires had been slashed and the windshield was smashed with rocks. He checked the interior of the truck and found that nothing was stolen, including his expensive laptop and his radio. Reportedly, the act of vandalism was a clear warning to leave the area and never return to the Black Hollow. He used his satellite phone to call for help and waited for the local police to arrive at his location. State records from 2015 show that the police response was delayed by several hours due to a fallen tree. Jacob sat on the ground and watched the forest with a sense of defeat as the rain began to fall. Two officers from the Logan County Sheriff Department arrived in a heavy four-wheel drive vehicle to help him today. They took a statement from Jacob and examined the damage to his truck with a look of bored and indifference. The county file from 2009 mentioned that vandalism was common in the remote parts of the mountain range. Jacob told them about the cabin and the figure he saw on the trail, but the officers simply shook heads. Some locals claimed that the police were aware of the illegal activities in the hollow, but chose to ignore them. He felt that they were not telling him everything they knew about the history of the Black Hollow and its residents. The survey project was officially suspended by the timber company 2 weeks after Jacob returned to the main office today. State records from 2016 indicate that the land was sold to an anonymous buyer who requested no further maps. Jacob never received an explanation for the sudden change in plans, and he was assigned to a different project site. He still has the photos of the ledger and the strange markings he found on the door of the cabin. Investigators never confirmed any of his claims, and the case of the vanished family remains an open and cold file. He sometimes thinks about the figure on the trail and wonders if they were trying to help or to hurt. Jacob Miller moved out of West Virginia in the year 2017 to work in the flatter terrain of Ohio. He avoids the woods and the mountains because the sound of breaking branches still makes him feel very uneasy now. Archived notes from the local newspaper mentioned that several more sightings of the figure occurred in 2018 and 19. Records conflict regarding the current status of the Black Hollow, but many people say it is a cursed place today. Jacob knows that the truth is likely much more mundane, but no less terrifying than any ghost or monster story. The Appalachian Mountains will continue to keep their secrets hidden in the deep hollows and the shadows of the forest. Before Jacob entered the woods, he stopped at a small gas station to buy some water and some trail snacks. The elderly woman behind the counter saw his survey maps and warned him to be careful near the old creek. She mentioned that her grandfather used to work in the mines until the day he saw something in the dark. Reportedly, the man never spoke another word for the rest of his life and died in the year 1960. Jacob dismissed her story as a local superstition designed to frighten outsiders who came to work on the mountain today. He now realizes that the warning was based on a very real and present danger that he did not understand. The survey pins were made of galvanized steel and were designed to last for at least 100 years in soil. Jacob recorded the serial numbers of each pin in his logbook to ensure that the data was accurate and verifiable. County records from 2012 showed that many pins from the original 1924 survey were missing or moved. Some archive notes suggested that the movement of the earth was responsible for the displacement of the boundary markers there. Jacob found it hard to believe that nature could move a heavy steel rod several feet without leaving any tracks. He suspected that someone was moving the markers to change the size of the property for their own personal gain. Dispatch logs from 2015 recorded a call from a woman who lived on the edge of the Logan County. She claimed that her dog would bark at the trees for hours every night until it finally disappeared in June. Investigators never confirmed if a predator was responsible or if the dog had simply run away into the deep woods. Jacob thought about this report as he sat in his truck and waited for the police to arrive at site. He wondered if the figure he saw on the trail had anything to do with the disappearance of the local. The silence of the mountain felt like a heavy weight that was pressing down on his chest and his mind. There are many stories like this one that come from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains every single year now. Most of them are dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much isolation in the deep wilderness areas. State records and county files provide a glimpse into the reality of the events, but they never tell the whole. Jacob Miller still dreams of the metallic scraping sound and the feeling of eyes watching him from the dark trees. He will never return to the Black Hollow, and he advises others to stay away from the deep Appalachian woods. The truth remains hidden in the archives and the memories of the few people who were brave enough to enter. In this new story, something followed them while camping. In the deep woods of the Cascade Mountains during July of 2024, a terrifying event reportedly changed two lives. Mark was a 28-year-old civil engineer who often looked for peace within the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. He had spent years exploring the various trails of Washington state, and he felt very comfortable in the dense evergreen forests. His partner, Sarah, was a 27-year-old pharmacy technician who wanted to escape the stress of her daily office work. They had planned this specific trip for several months, and they were both excited to spend some time under the stars. The couple arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning while the mist was still clinging to the tall pine trees. They checked their equipment one last time, and then they began the long journey toward a high ridge overlooking a lake. Dispatch logs from the Forest Service show that they had registered their itinerary with the local ranger station before they started. The path was steep and narrow, but they made good time as they climbed higher into the rugged and wild terrain. They reportedly found a suitable campsite near a small stream that provided them with a reliable source of fresh and cold water. Sarah began setting up their small tent, while Mark gathered enough firewood to last them through the duration of the chilly night. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows grew long across the forest floor as they finished their work. They didn't see anyone else on the trail that day, and they believed they were completely alone in the vast wilderness. While they were eating their dinner by the fire, Sarah mentioned that she felt a strange presence looming just beyond the light. Mark scanned the dark perimeter with his high-powered flashlight, but he didn't see anything unusual among the thick trunks of the trees. He told her that it was likely just a deer, or perhaps a small bear foraging for food in the nearby brush. They tried to relax, but the oppressive silence of the forest made them feel increasingly uneasy as the night grew much colder. State records later indicated that the couple went to sleep around 11 o'clock, but their rest was interrupted by a rhythmic tapping. Something was reportedly striking the side of their tent with a light and persistent force that sounded like a thin wooden stick. Mark sat up and listened intently to the sound, but it stopped as soon as he reached for his tactical camping knife. He didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he stayed quiet while he stared at the thin fabric of the tent wall. The next morning, they found several small stones placed in a perfect circle around the cold remains of their campfire from the night. Sarah was certain that those rocks were not there when they had gone to sleep, and she started to feel very afraid. Mark tried to find a logical explanation for the circle, but he couldn't think of any natural process that would do that. They decided to keep their original plan and hike further into the mountains, despite the growing sense of dread that they felt. County files from 2024 note that the couple felt a heavy presence following them as they moved up the trail. Every time they stopped to rest, they would hear the sound of branches breaking in the thick woods about 50 yards behind. Mark looked back several times, but the dense foliage made it impossible to see if a person or an animal was there. They couldn't explain why whatever was following them stayed just out of sight while maintaining such a consistent and frightening pace. As evening approached, they reached a high plateau that offered a wide view of the valley, but they didn't feel any safer. The wind began to pick up, and the temperature dropped rapidly as a thick layer of gray clouds moved over the peaks. They set up their camp in a small clearing, and they made sure to keep their gear very close to the tent. Sarah reportedly saw a tall and thin shadow move behind a large boulder, but it vanished before she could point it out. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the figure, but archived notes suggest that someone might have been living illegally in those woods. During the middle of the second night, the couple was woken up by the sound of heavy breathing just outside their tent. Mark didn't hesitate this time, and he shouted loudly to scare away whatever was standing right next to their sleeping heads. He heard something scramble away into the darkness, but the sounds were bipedal, and they definitely did not belong to a bear. The two hikers didn't wait for morning to arrive before they packed their essential items and started the long descent back down. They left their expensive tent and their heavy sleeping bags behind because they were terrified of staying in that location any longer. Every step they took felt like a race against an unseen predator that was watching them from the safety of the shadows. They reportedly reached their car as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the highest trees in Washington. A subsequent search by the local authorities found their abandoned gear, but there were no signs of a struggle at the camp. State records show that the case was eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or any identifiable suspects in the region. Records conflict regarding the number of similar reports, but some locals claimed that several other hikers had vanished in that specific area. Mark and Sarah never returned to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and they don't plan on going camping ever again in life. Local county files from 2024 describe the physical state of the abandoned items that the search party recovered near the ridge. The tent had been neatly folded, but the poles were missing and the fabric had several small holes that looked like bite marks. Sarah's digital camera was found resting on a flat rock about 20 yards away from the original site of their base camp. The investigators found no images on the memory card, except for a single blurry photo of a dark shape among the trees. A detailed report from the state records suggests that the hikers were lucky to have escaped the wilderness without any physical injuries. The region where they were camping has a long history of unexplained disappearances that date back to the early 1980s. Dispatch logs show that multiple search and rescue missions have been launched in that specific area over the last several decades. Most of those cases ended without any resolution, and the missing people were never seen by their friends or their families. Mark reportedly struggled with night terrors for several months after the incident, and he often woke up feeling like he was being watched. He told his therapist that he could still hear the sound of the heavy breathing right next to his ear every night. Sarah decided to move to a different city because the sight of the nearby mountains caused her to have severe panic attacks. They tried to find answers by talking to other hikers online, but they only found more stories that were equally disturbing. Records conflict about whether the authorities ever interviewed a suspicious man who was seen wandering near the trailhead that same weekend in July. This individual was reportedly wearing a heavy winter coat despite the warm weather, and he did not have any hiking or camping gear. He disappeared before the sheriff's deputies could arrive at the scene to ask him about his presence in the national forest area. No one knows for sure what was following Mark and Sarah that weekend, but the evidence remains locked in a county file. The trail they followed was known as the High Ridge Loop, which covers over 20 miles of some of the most difficult terrain. Archived notes from the local hiking club mention that several parts of the trail are prone to sudden fog and very low visibility. Mark and Sarah had prepared for these conditions by bringing extra layers of clothing and a reliable GPS device for their navigation needs. They didn't anticipate that the main threat would come from something that was watching them from within the shadows of the trees. When the search party arrived at the campsite, they noticed that the surrounding brush had been cleared in a very deliberate and unnatural way. State records indicate that the branches were snapped at a height of about 7 feet, which is much higher than any local animal. The investigators also found a small pile of rusted metal objects that had been placed carefully near the entrance of the abandoned tent. These items included old tin cans and a broken pocket watch that appeared to be from the early part of the 20th century. County files from 2024 show that the sheriff was deeply concerned about the strange patterns that were discovered at the forest site. There was no sign of a struggle or any blood, but the overall atmosphere of the camp was described as being very malevolent. One deputy reported hearing a faint whistling sound coming from the deep ravine while he was collecting the hikers' belongings for the official report. He didn't find the source of the noise, but he later resigned from his position at the department due to a nervous breakdown. Investigators never confirmed if the strange items found at the camp belonged to a person who had been living in the woods for years. Some locals claimed that an old hermit had been seen near the lake, but no official records exist to prove his actual identity. The case remains open, and it is still discussed by many people who enjoy exploring the mysteries of the Pacific Northwest wilderness region. Mark and Sarah's story serves as a grim reminder that some things in the woods are better left alone and completely undisturbed. The pharmacy where Sarah worked eventually granted her a long leave of absence so she could focus on her mental health and her recovery. She spent many hours in therapy trying to process the events of that weekend, but the fear remained deeply rooted in her mind. Mark also found it difficult to return to his normal life, and he eventually sold all of his camping and hiking equipment online. They don't talk about that trip anymore because the memories are too painful and they only want to move forward with their lives. Dispatch logs from the night of the incident reveal that several other callers had reported seeing strange lights in the sky over the forest. These reports were never linked to the experience of the two hikers, but they add another layer of mystery to the entire situation. Some people believe that the forest itself has a way of manipulating the minds of those who dare to enter its deepest parts. Records conflict on this theory, but the fact remains that Mark and Sarah were changed forever by what they experienced in Washington. The final report from the county coroner's office mentioned that no physical crimes were committed during the duration of the couple's camping trip. However, the psychological impact of being stalked by an unknown entity is often much more damaging than any physical injury could ever be. State records from 2024 are now archived, and they are only available to those who have a very specific legal reason. The truth about what happened on that high ridge in the Cascade Mountains may never be fully known by the public or authorities. A local reporter attempted to investigate the history of the High Ridge Loop, but he found that many of the files were missing. He reportedly spoke to a retired forest ranger who claimed that the government had purchased several large tracts of land in that area. These state records were allegedly sealed for national security reasons, but no one could explain why a forest would need such high protection. The reporter eventually dropped the story after he received several anonymous phone calls warning him to stop his research into the local matter. Mark once told a close friend that he saw a face peering through the mesh of the tent during the second night of camp. He described the features as being very pale and sunken with eyes that seemed to reflect the light of the dying embers outside. Sarah reportedly didn't see the face, but she felt the weight of something heavy pressing against the side of her sleeping bag. They both agreed that the entity was not trying to help them, but was instead waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trail has since been closed to the public due to a series of rock slides that made the path too dangerous for most hikers. Some locals claimed that the rock slides were not a natural event, but were instead caused by someone who wanted to keep people away. Investigators never confirmed these rumors, and the official state records simply cite the weather as the primary cause for the trail closure. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest remains a place of beauty and mystery, but for some, it is a place of absolute terror. The county file from 2024 includes a series of photographs taken of the ground where the tent had been located. These images show a pattern of deep depressions that look like someone had been kneeling in the dirt for a long time. Investigators never confirmed what caused these marks, but they were certainly not made by any equipment that the hikers had brought along. Some locals claimed that this specific spot was known to be avoided by the native tribes who lived in the region. State records show that the case was officially moved to a cold status after 6 months of investigation yielded no new leads. The hikers tried to resume their lives, but the psychological scars were far more permanent than they could have ever possibly imagined. Sarah reportedly sold her house and moved to a city that was far away from any large forests or remote wilderness areas. Mark began to study the local history of the Cascades in an attempt to find some kind of peace or closure. He reportedly found several old newspaper articles that mentioned a similar incident occurring in the same general area back in 1982. Those records conflict with the official police reports of that time, which stated that the missing hikers had simply lost their way. However, the archived notes from the search team described finding the exact same circle of stones around the abandoned campfire. This detail was never released to the general public, and it remains a secret kept within the locked files of the county. The story of Mark and Sarah is a quiet but terrifying example of the unknown dangers that can lurk in our world. We like to think that we're safe when we enter the woods, but the truth is often much more complex and frightening. They don't have the answers they're looking for, and they likely never will find the truth about that cold July weekend. Sometimes the things that follow us out of the darkness are the things that we can never truly understand or explain away. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch mountain range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archived notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. In this news story, something watched our campsite all night in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains hold a history of strange disappearances that the local park rangers rarely discuss with the general public. Griffin Holloway worked as a professional wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting rare bird species in the remote mountain wilderness. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last decade traveling through the most isolated mountain ranges. In October of 1998, he decided to travel to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains area. His goal for the trip was to photograph the rare northern goshawk during its peak migration through the hardwood forest. He arrived at the trailhead during a particularly cold afternoon when the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. Griffin packed his professional equipment, including a heavy tripod and a specialized long lens for his high-end film camera. He hiked 4 miles into the backcountry before he decided to set up a small camp near a stream. The area was quiet, and the nearest paved road was a full day of hiking away from his current location. He built a small fire and he cooked a simple meal before the sun began to set behind the peaks. As the light faded, he felt a sudden and very distinct sensation that someone was standing just beyond the forest. He turned his flashlight toward the shadows, but he saw only the twisted branches and the thick blankets of moss. Griffin shrugged off the feeling and he climbed into his sleeping bag to get some rest for the early morning. He woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something heavy moving slowly around the outer perimeter. The movement was calculated and deliberate, as if the intruder was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise on the protection. Griffin reached for his flashlight and he sat perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs in the dark. He heard a low and gravelly sound that resembled a person trying to clear their throat from a great distance. The photographer slowly unzipped the tent flap and he peered out into the misty clearing where the fire had died. He saw a pair of pale eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. The eyes remained perfectly stationary, and they did not blink even when he shone his bright flashlight directly at them. Griffin felt a surge of adrenaline, and he shouted a warning into the darkness to see if anyone would respond. There was no reply from the woods, and the eyes eventually vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, and he kept his knife close to his hand until, when the sun finally rose, he began to inspect the area around his tent for any signs of the visitor. He found a set of tracks that looked like bare human feet, but the toes were unusually long and thin. Griffin decided to conduct a formal investigation by setting up a series of motion-activated cameras around the campsite area. He spent the entire afternoon carefully hiding the lenses behind piles of brush and inside the hollow trunks of trees. He used a specialized high-speed film that was designed to capture clear images in very low light conditions indeed. While he was working, he found a discarded leather glove that did not belong to him near the creek bed. The glove was extremely old, and the leather had been stitched together with a material that looked like dried vine. He placed the glove in a plastic bag and he made a note of the exact location in his journal. That evening, he did not light a fire because he wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible in the. He sat in his tent with a pair of night vision goggles and he watched the tree line for movement. At midnight, he saw a group of 3 tall figures emerge from the shadows near the edge of the. They did not move like humans, but they walked with a rhythmic and swaying motion that was very unsettling too. One of the figures approached the spot where he had placed the motion-activated camera, and it stood perfectly still. It reached out a hand that had unusually long fingers, and it gently touched the lens of the expensive camera. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in a layer of matted and gray hair. Griffin realized that these beings were not interested in his food or his supplies, but were curious about his tools. They began to mimic the way he had moved earlier in the day by walking in a slow and deliberate. One of the figures picked up a small rock and it held the stone to its eye like a camera. Griffin felt a deep sense of dread as he watched the creatures study his behavior with a high level. He realized that they had been watching him since he first entered the woods 3 days ago on the trail. The photographer remained in his tent and he prayed that the creatures would not decide to enter his small shelter. After an hour of observation, the figures retreated back into the woods, and the forest became eerily silent once again. Griffin waited until the first light of dawn before he gathered his gear and began the long hike back. He moved as quickly as he could, but he constantly looked over his shoulder to see if he was followed. He reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, and he asked to speak with the senior officer on duty. The ranger was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Appalachian Mountains for over 30 years total. Griffin described the figures and the way they had mimicked his movements during the long night at the remote camp. Silas listened to the story with a grim expression, and he did not seem surprised by the details of the ranger explained that there were several reports of these beings dating back to the late 1800s in the on Rosette. He referred to them as the observers, and he said they were a group of feral people who lived. According to the archives, the observers did not attack hikers, but they were known for stealing items to use for. Silas showed Griffin a collection of items that had been recovered from abandoned camps over the last few decades of. The collection included rusted cameras and broken binoculars that had been carefully wrapped in animal skins and tied with vines. The ranger warned Griffin that the observers were becoming more bold and were starting to follow people closer to town. Griffin realized that the glove he found was likely a piece of clothing that the beings had tried to. The photographer returned to his home, but he could not stop thinking about the pale eyes in the dark forest. He processed the film from his motion-activated cameras, and he found several clear shots of the tall gray figures. The images showed the beings standing in a circle and looking directly into the camera lens with a curious expression. One of the figures was wearing the leather glove he had found near the creek bed earlier in the day. Griffin decided to share his findings with a local university professor who specialized in Appalachian history and human behavior. The professor examined the photos, and he suggested that the observers were a remnant of an ancient and isolated community. He believed that they had lost the ability to speak, but had developed a highly advanced system of visual mimicry. The university launched a small expedition to the area, but they found no trace of the observers or the... It seemed as though the beings knew they were being hunted, and they had moved deeper into the mountain range. Griffin never returned to that section of the woods, but he still keeps the photos in a locked desk. He sometimes hears a rhythmic tapping on his window at night, and he wonders if they have finally found. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where the past and the present often collide in ways that we cannot understand. Griffin Holloway eventually retired from wildlife photography, and he moved to a quiet town far away from the dark woods. He often tells his story to other hikers as a warning to always be aware of their surroundings. He knows that there are things in the mountains that do not want to be mapped or understood by. The legend of the observers continues to grow, and more people report seeing the pale eyes in the forest. Some people say that the beings are guardians of the wilderness, while others believe they are something much more. The ranger station still keeps a file on the disappearances, but the official cause is always listed as accidental. Griffin believes that the observers are still out there, and they are still watching the people who enter the D. He remembers the way the figure held the rock to its eye, and he knows they are still learning. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, and they do not give them up to anyone who is not invited. Every October, he looks at the mountains, and he remembers the night he was studied by the silent watchers. The investigation into the leather glove revealed that the stitching was made from a rare type of mountain orchid root. This plant only grows in the highest and most inaccessible parts of the mountain range near the rocky peaks. This discovery suggested that the observers had a deep knowledge of the local flora and how to use it. Griffin realized that the beings were far more intelligent than he had initially believed when he first saw them. He spent his final years writing a book about the experience, but he never published the final and most. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of photos to the local historical society in town. The researchers who studied the images found that the observers were often visible in the background of his earlier. It appeared that they had been following him for years before he ever noticed their presence in the dark. This realization changed the way the community viewed the forest and the people who lived in the mountain shadows. The mystery of the Appalachian observers remains unsolved, and the files are still open at the local sheriff office. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always lock their doors when the sun goes down. They know that the mountains are not just rocks and trees, but are home to something that is still. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small gift of fruit or cloth on the day. He says it is a way to keep the peace between the town and the beings who live above. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own offerings to the edge of the dark and thick. The forest seems to accept these gifts, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few. Griffin Holloway is buried in a small cemetery that overlooks the peaks he once loved to photograph so much. His headstone has a small carving of a camera and a single pair of eyes watching from the bottom. People who visit the grave often report feeling as though they are being observed from the trees near the prom. It is a fitting tribute to a man who spent his life looking at things that did not want. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green. The final recording Griffin made before he left the mountains was a simple description of the silence in the coding. He said that the woods were not truly quiet, but were filled with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. He believed that the mountain was one large organism and the observers were its eyes and its long ears. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The film from the motion-activated cameras is now stored in a climate-controlled vault to preserve the images. Many people have tried to find the clearing where Griffin camped, but the trails have changed over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect the beings who live in the shadows. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be found by those who do not belong there. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next person to... The story of the Appalachian Watchers is a reminder that we are never truly alone when we are outside. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that three other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set at. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. This is the most insane true story you'll hear today. People who worked that case still say it is the one story they cannot tell without someone accusing them of lying. The facts read like a movie script, yet every timestamp, camera frame, and access log pointed to the same impossible conclusion. A man walked into a concrete room with one door and never came back out, even though the door never opened again. The man was 32-year-old records clerk named Niall Verdon. He worked at a small regional bank in a mid-sized town, mostly handling paper archives and old loan files. Coworkers said he was quiet but funny when he relaxed, the type who remembered every birthday in the office and fixed jammed printers without complaining. He rented a small apartment near the river and spent his evenings rebuilding vintage keyboards. The bank itself occupied a renovated brick building on the corner of two calm streets. Underneath the lobby sat a secure records room built decades earlier when everything existed on paper. The room had reinforced walls, a thick steel door, and no windows. One ventilation duct ran overhead, too narrow for a person to crawl through. The only way in or out was the door that opened into a short hallway monitored by cameras. On a mild afternoon in early March, the branch manager asked Niall to retrieve a mortgage file from the records room. A local couple wanted to refinance an old property, and the file existed only in the basement archive. Niall grabbed a keycard, signed the access log, and headed toward the employee's stairwell. The timestamp on the sign-out sheet read 2:17. The hallway camera caught him emerging from the stairwell a few seconds later. He walked toward the records room carrying a small tablet and a clipboard. He seemed relaxed, shoulders loose, no sign of stress. The camera showed him swipe the keycard, wait for the indicator light to turn green, and pull the heavy door open. He stepped inside, still holding the tablet. The door closed behind him with a soft hydraulic hiss. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw him. Downstairs, the records room had its own tiny camera mounted in a corner near the ceiling. It aimed toward the rows of shelves and the desk where staff sorted files. For privacy reasons, the camera recorded only still frames every 8 seconds instead of full motion. That afternoon, it captured a clear shot of the empty room at 2:15 before he arrived. The next frame at 2:20 showed the same room completely unchanged, shelves in place, desk clear, no one inside. Even stranger, the access control system recorded the door opening once at 2:18 when he went in, then never again. No exit swipe, no second entry, nothing. According to the log, the door remained sealed until 4:06 when the branch manager forced it open with a mechanical override during the search. Upstairs, the first sign something was wrong came around 3:15. A teller realized Niall had not brought the file yet. She assumed he got distracted helping someone with a copier jam. At 3:30, she called his desk phone and heard it ring unanswered beside an empty chair. She checked the restroom and the break room. No sign of him. The manager eventually noticed and checked the digital board that showed employee locations based on keycard pings. It still listed Niall as present in the records area. The manager frowned and called down through the stairwell, expecting him to shout back. Silence answered. He took his own keycard, walked to the basement hallway, and checked the camera feed on the small monitor beside the door. The hallway footage showed no one entering or leaving since Niall went in. The feed from inside the records room still showed neat shelves and an empty desk. The manager thought the interior camera might have frozen, so he tapped the screen. The time tag updated in the corner. The room remained empty. At that point, he called building security and the non-emergency police line. 2 patrol officers arrived within minutes because the station sat only a few blocks away. They asked when anyone last saw him and reviewed the entry footage. Everything looked routine, no one followed him, no one waited in the hallway, and no one lingered near the door. At 4:06, the manager used a manual key to disengage the hydraulic lock and pulled the heavy door open while an officer filmed with his body camera. The records room lights turned on automatically. The shelves stood undisturbed. Dust lay evenly across the top boards. The small desk near the center held a closed ledger and an empty coffee mug. Niall was not there. They checked every aisle carefully. No file boxes sat out of place. The ventilation grate overhead remained firmly screwed. The duct beyond measured barely wider than a shoebox. The walls showed no cracks or access panels. The floor was solid concrete with no crawl space beneath. On the desk, they found the mortgage reference number scrawled on a notepad in his handwriting. The chair sat pushed back as if no one had used it all afternoon. There was no sign of struggle. No dropped keys, no torn clothing, nothing that suggested he had even started looking through the files. The access system confirmed only one person had opened that door in the last 6 hours. His keycard had not been used anywhere else in the building since. Security checked every other door log and every camera angle. It was as if he stepped into the room and evaporated. The first theory involved simple error. Investigators assumed the access system malfunctioned or the interior camera failed. A technician ran diagnostics on both. The system time matched the branch server and the central bank office. The logs showed no interruptions or resets that day. The stamps lined up with the video frames. The hallway camera never missed a minute. Investigators interviewed every employee. No one saw Niall leave early. No one else went downstairs around the time of his disappearance. The building remained locked to the public after lunch due to a brief training meeting, so random visitors could not wander through unnoticed. Delivery logs showed no contractors or repair crews on site. His personal items stayed at his desk: phone, backpack, jacket, and house keys. His car sat untouched in the employee lot, with the morning coffee cup still in the cup holder. His apartment later checked out clean, with dishes drying on a rack-and-a-half finished keyboard project on the table. The case grew stranger when the digital forensics team examined his tablet. It had remained on the records room access shelf because he apparently set it down while swiping the keycard. According to the power log, the screen lit briefly at 2:19 and a search app opened. The logged query typed into the search bar read March folder anomaly. No one could explain what he meant by that because no March folder existed in the archive system. Even more bizarre, a system admin reviewing backups discovered that years earlier, another clerk flagged a minor issue with the March mortgage boxes. The note described hearing faint shuffling in the room when no one else was present. The clerk thought papers settled on their own. She wrote the note mainly as a joke, then left the job a month later. That note sat buried in the digital archive until the admin stumbled across it after the disappearance. As the town began buzzing with rumors, a new detail emerged from an unlikely source. A retiree who volunteered at the local historical society came forward with an old photograph. It showed the bank building right after its renovation years earlier, with staff standing in front holding a banner. In the back row near the corner stood a young man who looked disturbingly like Niall, wearing older-style glasses and a name tag with a smudged first letter. The bank swore he never worked there before his current job. Payroll did not list another person with his last name in previous decades. His hiring paperwork showed he joined the branch only 3 years earlier after moving from another county. The resemblance in the photo could have been a coincidence, but several officers privately said it unsettled them. The strangest piece of evidence arrived 3 days after he vanished. The branch manager sat at his desk finalizing statements for investigators when an alert popped up on his screen. Someone had just logged in to the records catalog from a terminal assigned to the basement room. The timestamp read 10:26 in the morning. The manager froze, then bolted for the stairwell with 2 officers at his heels. They sprinted down to the basement, keycards ready. The hallway camera later showed them rushing past in a blur. They reached the door, checked the monitor, and saw the familiar still of neat shelves. No one stood at the desk. The access log showed the door remained locked. The manager opened it anyway. The room stood empty as before. Yet the terminal screen glowed softly. On the monitor, an active session displayed the mortgage catalog. The last search completed in the system read exactly the same as on Niall's tablet. March folder anomaly. Beneath that line, in the user notes section where clerks sometimes left comments, a new entry appeared. It contained 3 words typed in jagged letters that did not match his usual neat style. Do not open. Later, handwriting analysis said the jagged text still belonged to him, distorted by stress or unfamiliar posture. The system recorded the username associated with that login. It was his. The session originated from a wired terminal that existed only inside that concrete room. Forensic experts tried to blame glitches. Perhaps a delayed login fired from a previous day. Maybe someone reused his credentials. Every theory died against the access records and power charts. The terminal had been in sleep mode for hours before that session started. No other keycards pinged the basement, no one down there typed anything according to every camera in the building. As news spread, locals pitched theories ranging from secret tunnels to outside sabotage. Engineers walked the foundation and found nothing. The original construction permits showed no hidden corridors around the records room. A staff member suggested maybe he panicked, hid, and slipped out in a blind spot. That idea crumbled when cameras across the lobby and exits showed no matching figure. After weeks of searching fields, interviewing family, and checking highway cameras around town, the investigation stalled. No sign of Niall turned up anywhere. Financials remained untouched. There were no secret debts, no messages suggesting a planned disappearance, and no reason for him to make himself vanish during a normal workday. Eventually, the bank sealed the basement room. They moved remaining paper files to a different facility and installed a steel plate over the original doorframe. The terminal was removed and stored in evidence. The circular camera feed for that room now shows only a blank wall. The town still tells the story in quiet tones. People who banked there for decades now avoid talking about the basement. Former employees report occasional dreams of walking between shelves while a low vibration runs through the floor. The photograph with the possible twin face sits in a folder at the Historical Society, pulled out only when someone insists the whole thing sounds made up. Investigators filed the case as a missing person with unusual circumstances and no signs of voluntary departure. Off the record, several admit it is the one event they cannot explain without breaking the usual rules of how rooms and doors are supposed to work. A man walked into a space with one entrance. The door never opened again, and yet he was gone, leaving behind only his neat handwriting on a note that warned someone to leave that same space sealed. It remains a real event in a real town, backed by logs, video, and systems that never showed faults before or after. The more someone studies it, the more insane it feels, as if the ordinary concrete under that bank briefly stopped behaving like everyone expects, just long enough to take one careful records clerk away and leave nothing but questions behind. The most unbelievable true story I never thought I'd tell. People who knew the main subject of this story said he never wanted it shared, yet the title came from his final written note in a sealed incident report. The story centered on a 40-year-old technician named Latham Royce who worked for a regional utility company that serviced rural counties with long miles of aging power lines. He preferred quiet schedules and predictable routes, and he kept to himself outside of work. That day, he planned a routine inspection run toward a hillside substation that often suffered weather damage. He left his small office building shortly after sunrise and loaded his truck with standard tools and a handheld meter. He told dispatch he would check the substation, inspect a few nearby relay posts, and return before mid-afternoon. The weather looked clear and the roads felt familiar. Latham enjoyed the quiet drive because early routes rarely involved complicated repairs. He parked near the substation gate and listened to the hum from the transformers as he prepared his gear. The incident began when he walked toward the main relay cabinet and noticed the lock hanging open. The padlock sat on the ground as if placed carefully rather than dropped. He knelt to check for damage and saw faint scrape marks on the metal that suggested someone tried forcing the latch recently. He photographed the cabinet for documentation and radioed dispatch to report tampering. When no reply came, he assumed the signal dipped behind the hill and continued inspecting the site. He opened the cabinet and saw a thick strand of wire removed from its proper mount and laid across the bottom in a strange curved pattern. The wire showed no arc marks or heat damage, which ruled out common electrical faults. He traced the pattern with his eyes and realized it resembled a shaped track rather than loose wire placement. He took another photo and noted the direction of the curve in his log. The surrounding gravel showed footprints that did not match his boot style. The complication deepened when he followed the footprints toward a ridge behind the substation. The prints ended near a small patch of ash on the ground. The ash pile looked too neat and dense for normal debris. He used a small metal probe to lift a fragment and realized it came from burned paper. A partially intact corner displayed faint grid lines consistent with utility schematics. He searched the area and found a second fragment with the letters RO faintly visible. Latham felt uneasy because missing schematics indicated a serious breach. He stepped farther into the brush and found a small metal tag half buried under leaves. The number on the tag matched an older transformer once listed in a unit that had been replaced years earlier. He placed the tag in a sample bag and photographed the location. He sensed someone had walked the ridge recently. The branches along the narrow path leaned in one direction and showed fresh breaks. He radioed dispatch again, but only heard static. He climbed the ridge to get better reception and paused at the highest point. From there, he noticed a narrow service road that did not appear on his current map. The road looked recently used because tire grooves cut through the dirt with crisp edges. He followed the grooves for several yards and found a broken reflector post lying beside the path. The brake marks looked clean enough to be recent. A damp paper scrap fluttered between the weeds. He picked it up and saw part of a handwritten note. Only 3 words remained. Leave it covered. The ink smudged near the corner. He checked his surroundings and listened for movement. A metallic clink echoed from further down the hidden road. He walked cautiously and saw a relay junction box standing open with the cover resting neatly against a stump. Inside the box, he found a laminated tag that did not match any current company design. The investigation grew more complicated when he returned to the substation to run a full diagnostic check. His handheld meter showed healthy readings at every point except one large grounding conductor that displayed inconsistent spikes. The spikes resembled intentional interference rather than random fluctuations. He traced the grounding conductor to an old anchor point near the fence line. The soil around the anchor looked recently disturbed and darker than the surrounding dirt. He crouched to examine the soil and spotted a folded sheet tucked between 2 rocks. He pulled it free and realized it was a partially burned maintenance log from 1998. The log listed several relay inspections performed by a technician whose name he did not recognize. The final entry read something about a pattern found near the ridge and an instruction to secure the record until further review. No follow-up pages existed. Latham checked the substation perimeter again and noticed a small camera housing tucked near the base of a transformer that should not have had any surveillance attached. The housing held no active components. It was only a shell, yet someone had placed it deliberately to resemble a working device. Inside the shell, he found a cut strip of metallic tape containing faint impressions, like someone pressed a thin tool against it. He photographed it and stored it in his pack. He returned to the ridge with renewed caution. The tire tracks on the hidden road continued toward a section where the dirt thinned and revealed old concrete remains from a small demolished shed. Under a slab, he found another ash pile containing char marks consistent with burned notebook bindings. He collected samples and recorded the time. He noticed a torn binder ring half sunk into the soil. The ring held tiny flecks of paper around its hinge. As he moved past the slab, he heard a sound that made him stop. Someone called his name from the direction of the service road. He froze. He had not told anyone his location except dispatch, and dispatch never responded to his earlier calls. He waited for movement and called out who was there, but the voice did not answer. Instead, another metallic clink echoed across the clearing. The sound came from behind him this time. He turned quickly and saw no one. He stepped toward the road and heard his name again. Same tone and same distance. He felt his throat tighten because the voice matched his supervisor's voice almost perfectly. He tried the radio once more, but only static returned. He walked backward toward open ground while scanning the trees. The forest looked undisturbed, yet the voice repeated his name in the same calm tone. The timing felt off because the voice never shifted in volume or direction. Latham hurried to his truck and locked the doors. He started the engine and drove toward the main road. As he pulled away, he saw a figure standing at the ridge overlook. The figure wore a light jacket similar to the standard issue for his company. He slowed briefly to look. The figure never moved. The posture looked rigid and the face remained shadowed by the sun angle. He accelerated down the road until the figure vanished from view. Later that afternoon, he filed an incident report at the regional office. He provided photos of every detail: the curved wire pattern, the burned schematics, the old log page, the unusual tracks, the missing camera interior, the mysterious voice. He expected immediate follow-up, but the report moved into a restricted folder by the next morning. A supervisor told him to treat the event as a misunderstanding caused by outdated equipment and environmental interference. The twist arrived when an older technician approached him privately 2 days later. The man said he remembered a similar incident in 1998 involving unexplained interference and missing documents. He recalled a technician named Rourke who left the company suddenly after reporting a pattern near the ridge. The man said Rourke claimed someone else had spoken his name during the inspection, even though no one else was present. Latham checked archived notes and found a redacted summary describing a suspended review connected to the old substation. The summary listed several missing logbooks and referred to an unknown visitor observed near the ridge. The entry ended with a directive to discontinue further field checks of that area without written approval. Latham realized the burned papers matched the missing logs. He no longer doubted what happened at the ridge. Someone had tampered with the site long before his visit, and someone continued observing technicians who inspected the area. The voice that called his name likely came from a recording device or a hidden repeater used to lure him closer. He felt grateful he left as soon as he did. He added a final handwritten note to the report before sealing it. The button settled when Latham requested reassignment to a different region. He told a few close friends that he did not want that story shared, yet he felt relieved someone finally documented the evidence. He never again returned to the ridge. People who read the archived notes said his final line explained the title perfectly. He wrote that it was the most unbelievable true story he never thought he would tell. In this new story. Terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after two members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archive notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archive notes from the forensic examination describe the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archived notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty. This "no way that's true" story turned out to be real. Most people in that small township thought the claim was a joke at first. A guy said his house kept calling itself from the future. Neighbors laughed, coworkers teased him, and even the deputy who filed the first report admitted he barely kept a straight face. Yet the evidence that followed forced everyone to rethink what they believed about ordinary nights in an ordinary place. The man who made the claim was 34-year-old line cook named Tarvin Pike. He lived alone in a narrow rental near a patch of quiet farmland. He worked mostly dinner shifts at a family restaurant and spent his late nights repairing old radios that he bought from yard sales. Friends described him as patient and self-critical, the type who checked door locks twice and kept spare batteries in every drawer. The call that started everything came on a bland Monday evening in early spring. Tarvin said he stood in his kitchen heating leftover stew when his cell phone buzzed with an unknown number. He let it ring once before answering with a cautious hello. A short burst of static followed, then a thin, distant voice asked whether anyone survived the blast. The voice matched his own. He froze and listened while the caller repeated the question. The words sounded strained and shaky. Something clattered near the microphone. Then the voice whispered that the hallway collapsed and smoke covered the ceiling. The line cut out abruptly with a sharp crack. Tarvin stared at the screen and noticed the number belonged to a landline. The area code matched his own township. He owned no landline. After several minutes of pacing, he called the number back. A recorded message told him the number was unassigned. He told himself that the voice only sounded similar because people often mishear phone audio. He convinced himself enough to sleep, though he checked every outlet before turning off the lights. The next day, he mentioned the call to a coworker who laughed and suggested a prank recording. That night, the same number called again. This time, the voice said the roof had shifted and something heavy blocked the back door. Tarvin recognized how frightened the voice sounded. He also recognized the slight tremor in certain phrases, the same tremor he developed under stress. The call ended with a gasp and a muffled thud. He saved the call log and contacted the sheriff office. A deputy named Lyra Mavon took the report and admitted it sounded unusual but harmless. She suggested number spoofing or recycled lines from a decommissioned system. She told him to ignore further calls unless someone threatened him directly. He agreed, even though his hands shook when he left the office. 2 nights later, the pattern escalated. The same number rang at nearly the same time. The voice whispered with raw dread, saying the air smelled like burning plastic and the floor cracked near the living room. Tarvin begged the caller to identify a location. The voice said the house address clearly, the same one he currently lived in. The line filled with static, then went silent. He dropped his phone and ran outside, expecting flames or smoke. The night air stayed calm and cool. His windows glowed faintly from the kitchen light. The roof looked intact. The siding remained unmarked. He walked around the property twice. Nothing appeared damaged. Yet the call kept echoing in his mind. The next day, Tarvin convinced a friend with basic tech skills to examine the call data. The records looked clean, with timestamps that matched his phone log exactly. The tracing app they tried showed the origin within a few dozen yards of his house. His friend shrugged and said glitches happen, but admitted he had never seen one this precise. On the following night, the call came earlier. The voice spoke with uneven breathing and said the power failed inside the house. Tarvin checked his lights. Everything worked normally. The voice continued, saying the ceiling snapped and dust poured down. Then it begged for help and said the fire moved too fast. The call ended with a drawn-out hiss. He contacted Deputy Lyra again and asked her to listen to the recordings. She visited his house after her shift and stood in his kitchen while he played the audio. She listened quietly with a deep crease forming between her eyebrows. She asked whether he used audio editing tools or downloaded anything unusual. He shook his head. She replayed one section where the voice shouted his own name. It sounded undeniably like him. She recommended placing a small audio recorder near the landline port, though the house had no active line. She reasoned that stray signals sometimes traveled along old copper wires even after disconnection. Tarvin agreed and positioned a recorder near the baseboard outlet that once held a phone jack. He also moved one near the breaker panel in case interference came through wiring. Nothing happened for 2 nights. Then, at 2:17 on a Thursday morning, the recorder near the old phone jack captured a soft, repeated tone. It sounded like a failing alarm, one rising pulse followed by a short pause. The tone played 5 times, then fell silent. "If you have impassives." Tarvin heard none of it in real time, but discovered it the next morning while checking the device. He showed the audio to Deputy Lyra, who admitted she heard something similar in old fire investigation files. She recalled a case where a faulty smoke detector emitted an identical pattern shortly before a kitchen blaze consumed a rental. She checked the old file number and noted the incident occurred 10 years earlier on the other side of the township. The mapping system displayed the old property number. It matched Tarvin's current address. The township rebuilt the rental after the fire, installing new drywall, new wiring, and upgraded alarms. The previous owner sold the renovated place to a developer who later sold it to a private landlord. Somewhere between those transactions, the fire history vanished from online records, though handwritten notes still existed in the archived box. According to those notes, one witness claimed to hear someone shouting inside moments after the alarm failed. Fire crews arrived within 7 minutes. They found no bodies and no sign that anyone lived there at the time. The following night, the call returned with more urgency. The voice shouted that heat warped the hallway and the roof sagged. It said sparks leapt from the breaker panel. Tarvin reviewed the call repeatedly and recognized a phrase he used often without realizing it, a way he said the word panel with a clipped vowel. It made his stomach twist. Late that night, he unplugged every appliance and cut the breaker intentionally. The house fell completely silent. He waited in the darkness with a lantern beside him. After 20 minutes, the air felt oddly heavy, like the temperature dropped slightly. Dust drifted from a ceiling vent. He convinced himself the vent simply needed cleaning. Then the same unassigned number called. This time, the caller sounded far away, barely audible through rising static. The voice said the living room window had blown inward and smoke covered everything. It coughed harshly and gasped for help. Tarvin shouted into the phone, but the voice barely responded. The call ended abruptly with the sound of something collapsing. He ran outside again and scanned the house. Everything looked solid under the moonlight. No smoke, no cracked windows, no shifting roof lines. Yet, while standing by the driveway, he smelled something faintly chemical, like scorched insulation. The scent dissipated quickly. He could not tell whether it came from his imagination or the breeze. He called Deputy Lyra from the porch. She arrived within minutes and stayed until after 2 in the morning. Together, they opened every cabinet, checked the attic hatch, and inspected the breaker panel. The wiring looked normal. No scorch marks appeared anywhere. Yet both admitted hearing a soft ticking in the living room that neither could trace. The ticking stopped whenever they approached, then returned faintly when they stepped back. Over the next few days, the calls lessened and then stopped entirely. Tarvin recorded no further strange tones or voice messages. The air inside the house returned to its usual dry stillness. He slept lightly, though, expecting another late-night ring. A week later, an unexpected envelope arrived in his mailbox. The return address came from the state fire marshal headquarters. Inside the envelope sat a thin photocopy of an old report flagged strictly for archival review. The accompanying note said the office apologized for misplacing certain documents and wanted to provide complete history for any resident living in a structure rebuilt after a previous incident. The report detailed the blaze from a decade earlier. It included a timeline with approximate minutes for alarm activation, roof collapse, and smoke spread. The handwritten minute marks matched the timestamps of every call Tarvin received. Each message from the unknown number aligned with one stage of the original fire. One margin note even described a witness who thought she heard a man yelling his own name shortly before the front window shattered. Tarvin brought the report to Deputy Lyra, who read the timeline several times. She opened the audio clips and placed them side by side with the report. The correlation bordered on exact. She told him that if she submitted this as evidence, she would lose her job. She also said he should consider moving. He moved out within a month. The landlord never disclosed new tenants. The house sat dark for weeks before lights returned sporadically. Neighbors said they sometimes saw a figure in the kitchen window late at night, though no cars parked in the driveway. Deputy Lyra kept a copy of the recording logs in her desk drawer. Occasionally, she played them quietly at the end of her shift. Something about the voice felt caught between two moments, like hearing a call trapped inside a broken timeline that kept bleeding through the same walls rebuilt after a decade. The state fire records now show the rebuilt house as compliant and safe. The official file on the earlier blaze lists no casualties. Yet the calls received by Tarvin left behind something difficult to classify. They documented a person experiencing a fire in a house already rebuilt years earlier, speaking with a voice that matched someone alive in the present, calling from a number that technically never existed. Every analysis ends the same way. The logs were real, the timestamps were real, and the reconstruction of the earlier incident aligns too well to dismiss. It remains one of those quiet, unsolved events, the kind people whisper about when they stand near old wiring or creaking rafters. A story that should have been impossible, but left behind recordings that made one thing clear. It turned out to be real in every way that mattered, even if nobody could explain how. In this new story, people who went into West Virginia's woods and never came back. Many hikers believe that the deep forests of the Appalachian Range are just quiet places for weekend camping trips today. There are stories in the West Virginia mountains about travelers who walked into the trees and simply vanished forever now. This documented account follows a professional geologist who discovered a remote campsite that should not have existed at all. Gideon Vance was a 46-year-old hydrogeologist who specialized in mapping underground springs in very remote areas. He was known for his calm personality and his ability to survive in the wilderness for several weeks alone. In the spring of 2022, Gideon was hired to survey a valley near the edge of the forest. The local residents warned him about a specific ridge where the compass needles often spun in circles without any reason. Gideon did not believe in local superstitions, and he focused on the scientific data provided by his expensive digital tools. He packed his waterproof gear and hiked deep into a canyon where the cell phone signals were completely non-existent. The equipment in his heavy pack included a laser level and a high-precision digital watch that used satellite signals. He carried enough food for 7 days and a small weatherproof logbook to record his various scientific observations daily. The air in the canyon was heavy and smelled of damp moss and the ancient stone of the rising mountain. On the second morning of his trip, Gideon reached a clearing that was not marked on any of his maps. He found a canvas tent that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, sitting near a cold stone fire. There were no modern items like plastic bottles or synthetic fabrics anywhere near the small and very quiet campsite. He called out to see if anyone was nearby, but the only response was the sound of the wind through. Gideon approached the tent and noticed a cast iron skillet sitting on the rocks with fresh bacon grease inside it. He felt a sudden chill even though the sun was shining brightly over the high ridges of the deep valley. Inside the tent, he found a wooden crate containing supplies and a tattered leather journal with yellowed and fragile pages. The handwriting was neat and described a hiking trip taken by two brothers in the summer of 1954. He noticed that the local wildlife seemed unusually quiet, which was a detail he noted in his small weather logbook. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his ears as he turned the brittle pages of the old book. The final entry was dated June 12th and mentioned a strange humming sound coming from the rocks nearby that morning. Gideon looked at the ground and saw a pair of leather boots that looked brand new despite the vintage style. He picked up a newspaper from the crate and saw the headline was from the year 1954 today. He heard a branch snap behind him and turned to see two men wearing heavy flannel shirts and denim pants. The men looked confused and asked Gideon why he was wearing such strange and brightly colored synthetic hiking clothes today. They explained that they had only been camping for 2 days and were waiting for their father to return soon. Gideon realized with a shock that these men matched the descriptions of two brothers who disappeared 70 years ago today. He checked his watch and noticed that the date on his digital screen was now flickering between different years rapidly. The brothers, whose names were Alistair and Emmett, noticed the laser level on his tripod and backed away in terror. Gideon tried to explain that he was a scientist, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He felt a sense of overwhelming vertigo, as if the ground beneath his boots was turning into a gray mist. He ran back toward the main trail and did not look back at the clearing or the two lost brothers. The woods looked different in the fading light, and every tree seemed to shift its position when he turned now. When he reached his truck, he found that the police were already there searching for a missing man named Gideon. The officer named Dalton Grady told him that he had been missing for over 3 weeks in the deep woods. Gideon felt like he had only been away from his vehicle for 2 hours before he reached the main road. He checked his pack and found the leather journal from 1954 sitting right on top of his maps. The final page now had a new entry that described a man in bright orange clothes who visited their camp. Gideon never returned to that part of the West Virginia forest, and he left the geology profession shortly after that. He still dreams about the humming sound in the rocks and the smell of the fresh bacon in the woods. The mountains of West Virginia continue to hold their secrets in the deep places where time does not always move. Some structures are not built of wood and stone, but are woven into the very fabric of the passing years. If you find yourself lost in the woods near the border, you should probably keep moving until the sun comes. The ending of the tale sounds fake until you see the journal and the date written in your own hand. The truth is a shadow that follows you home from the woods and stays with you until the very end. This event remains one of the most puzzling cases in the archives of the local search and rescue teams today. Witness statements from the family members of the missing brothers confirm that the handwriting in the journal is perfectly authentic. The police files include photographs of the campsite that Gideon found, but the clearing was empty when they arrived there. They found no tent and no fire and no signs of the two brothers who had been seen by Gideon. The only evidence left behind was the journal that Gideon had taken from the wooden crate during his initial discovery. Forensic analysis of the paper showed that it was manufactured in the early 1950s, but it showed no aging. The ink was still fresh, and the leather binding had not yet developed the cracks typically found on antique books. Geologists who studied the canyon reported that the rock formations contain unusual magnetic properties that might affect local electronic devices. Some researchers believe that the humming sound Gideon heard was a result of geological pressure deep within the mountain range. Others suggest that the canyon is a place where different eras overlap for a few minutes when the weather changes. Gideon Vance spent several years trying to understand the physics of his experience, but he never found a clear answer. He often visits the county library to look at the missing persons files from the middle of the last century. He found a report about Alistair and Emmett that mentioned they were last seen carrying a heavy canvas camping tent. The photograph in the file showed two young men who were the exact same people Gideon met in the clearing. Their father had also disappeared that same week and was never found by the police or the local search parties. The case remains officially open because the bodies of the brothers were never recovered from the deep and dark woods. Gideon believes that the brothers are still in the canyon waiting for their father to return to their small camp. He often wonders if they saw him as a ghost from the future or a demon from another world entirely. The memory of their confused faces stays with him, and he can still hear their voices in his quiet mind. The forest has grown over the trails that lead to that specific coordinate, and the maps are no longer accurate. The government has restricted access to the valley, citing environmental concerns and the danger of the steep and rocky terrain. Most people who live in the area avoid the mountain and tell their children to stay away from the trees. They know that the woods can take a person and hold them for 70 years without letting them grow old. The silence of the mountain is a warning to those who think they can master the secrets of the wild. If you hear a humming sound in the rocks, you should turn around and run as fast as you. Do not look for the clearing and do not speak to the men who are wearing the flannel shirts today. The past is a dangerous place, and it does not always let you return to the present day in one fort. The ending of the story is the part that stays with you when you are walking alone in the night. The mystery is the heart of the wild, and the heart of the wild is a cold and dark. Gideon Thorne is the only witness to a truth that science cannot explain or even begin to understand fully now. The archived dispatch logs from the night of his return record a man who was terrified of his own watch. The officers who processed the report noted that Gideon appeared to have aged several years in just a few weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spoke in a hurried whisper about a camp that did not exist on maps. They took his statement and filed it away with the other unexplained reports from the Appalachian mountain range this year. The journal is kept in a safe at the university where researchers occasionally study the strange and fresh ink. No one has been able to reproduce the magnetic conditions that Gideon described in his detailed and very professional notes. The mountain continues to stand over the valley, and the fog still rolls through the trees in the morning. Some say the brothers are still there, and they are still waiting for the sun to go down today. The story of the surveyor is a warning to those who believe that time is a straight and simple line. It is a loop that can catch you and hold you in a moment that never ends or begins. The woods of West Virginia are deep, and they are very old, and they do not like to be. The ending of the story sounds fake until you stand in the fog and hear the sound of the rocks. The truth is in the journal, and the journal is in the safe, and the safe is in the forest is waiting for the next person to lose their way in the mist of the high ridges. The tale is told, and the listener is warned, and the cabin is waiting in the deep and dark. The story of Gideon Vance is a legacy of the unknown in the heart of the great American wild. The ending is the part that stays with you when you turn off the light at the end day. The mystery is the ending, and the ending is the mystery in the quiet woods of the mountain range. The story is finished, and the forest is dark, and the mountains are silent, and the truth is free. The geologist is home, and the camp is gone, and the brothers are waiting for their father to return soon. The ending is the beginning of the next story, in the heart of the great and ancient mountain wild. The tale of the man who saw the past in the present is done for now in the woods are calling, and the fog is rolling, and the mystery is yours to keep for a long. The ending is the silence that follows the final word of the story of the lost and the truth. The truth is a shadow in the trees, and the trees are the only ones who know the secrets. The story is done, and the fire is out, and the dark is all that remains in the fire. The forensic evidence of the journal remains the only physical proof that the brothers were ever seen after 1954. Handwriting experts compared the new entry to the older pages and found they were written by the same person. This would mean that the boy from the past wrote about Gideon in the future with the same pen today. The local sheriff continues to keep the case on his desk because it is the only one he cannot solve. He looks at the vintage boots in the evidence room and wonders how they could stay so clean and new. The valley is a place where the air stays still and the seasons do not follow the normal calendar cycles. Gideon Vance never went back to the mountains, and he never looked at another digital watch for his entire life. He preferred the steady ticking of an old mechanical clock that stayed in the present moment with him at home. The story of the disappearance is told in hushed tones by the residents of the nearby mountain town of Blackwood. They know that the woods are not just trees and rocks, but are a living part of the local Blackwood. The mystery is a gift for those who listen to the whispers of the wild and the hidden places now. The ending of the tale is the part you will remember when you are walking alone in the forest. The story is a circle, and the circle is a map, and the map leads back to the start. The truth is a fire that burns in the heart of the dark and the silence of the mountain.